I was 19 when my family disowned me for choosing art over accounting. 12 years later, they suddenly want to reconnect, right after my tech company sold for $12 million. Funny how disappointing black sheep transforms into beloved daughter when bank accounts change. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the Whitford family meant one thing above all else: expectations. In our sprawling colonial home in Greenwich, Connecticut, success wasn't measured in happiness but in predictable achievements: the right schools, the right career, the right spouse. My father, Richard Whitford, was the third-generation CEO of Whitford Financial Services, a regional investment firm my grandfather had built from nothing. My mother, Eleanor, managed our family's social calendar with the precision of a military strategist, ensuring the Whitford name maintained its standing in Greenwich's elite circles. At 28, I'm Victoria Whitford, though I go by Tori now, a small act of rebellion my family never approved of. Victoria is a dignified name, my mother would say. Why diminish yourself with a nickname? But diminishing myself was precisely what staying Victoria felt like. I was always the outlier. While my older brother James followed our father's footsteps into finance, graduating with honors from Wharton before joining the family firm, I was drawing in sketchbooks during family dinners and asking questions that made my parents exchange. Those looks, the ones that silently communicated, "What are we going to do about her?" The first real conflict came during my junior year of high school. I'd been accepted to a prestigious summer arts program in New York City. The day the acceptance letter arrived, I'd been so excited I could barely breathe. This program had launched careers. Famous artists, designers, and creative directors had walked through its doors. Getting in felt like validation that maybe, just maybe, my passion wasn't just a phase as my parents insisted. "Absolutely not," my father had said without even looking up from his Wall Street Journal. "You'll intern at the firm this summer," as we discussed. But we hadn't discussed it. He had decided, as he decided everything. "Dad, this is important to me," I pleaded. "This program could help me get into a good art school." That got his attention. He lowered his paper slowly, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation. "Art school? Victoria, we've already mapped out your education. Undergrad at Yale, like James and I both did, then MBA, then you'll take your place in the firm, handling our client relations division. Your grades are acceptable for Yale, but you'll need to focus more in your senior year." My mother, ever the peacemaker when it came to my father, had interjected. "Victoria, dear, art is a lovely hobby, but it's not a career for someone of your background." That night, I cried until my eyes were swollen, not just because I couldn't attend the program, but because I'd finally articulated to myself what I'd known for years. The path they'd chosen for me would slowly suffocate everything I loved about myself. I did what was expected. I declined the summer program. I applied to Yale. I was accepted, partly on merit, and partly, I suspected, because the business school had a Whitford conference room, courtesy of my father's generous donations. I declared a business major and took the requisite economics classes. That made me feel hollow inside. But I also did something unexpected. I secretly applied to the Rhode Island School of Design, one of the top art schools in the country. When my acceptance letter came, I hid it in my desk drawer like contraband, taking it out late at night to read and reread the words that represented a different life, a life where I could be me. The decision to deviate from my predetermined path wasn't made in a single moment of defiance. It was a quiet accumulation of realizations. The way my hand craved a pencil during endless family discussions about market fluctuations. How alive I felt in my one permitted elective art class. The growing certainty that following my parents' plan would lead to a life of well-dressed unhappiness. 2 weeks before fall semester began, I sat my parents down in the formal living room where all important Whitford discussions occurred. I had rehearsed my speech countless times, tweaking the words to sound mature, considered, grateful. I've decided to attend Rhode Island School of Design instead of Yale, I said, my voice shaking but determined. I've received a significant scholarship, and I believe this is the right path for me. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's hand flew to her pearl necklace, a reflexive gesture she made when distressed. My father's face underwent an alarming transformation from confusion to disbelief, to a cold anger I'd never seen directed at me before. "This is ridiculous," he finally said. "You're not throwing away generations of family tradition to doodle for 4 years. It's not doodling, Dad. It's industrial design. It's a respected field with real career opportunities. I could work for major corporations designing products or in architecture or—" Enough. His voice wasn't raised, which somehow made it worse. "This is clearly a phase, and I won't indulge it. You will attend Yale as planned. This discussion is over." But it wasn't over. For the first time in my life, I stood my ground. I've already accepted RISD's offer and declined Yale's. Classes start next week and I'm going. What followed was 2 hours of escalating tension. My mother crying, my father threatening to cut off my tuition, my desperate attempts to make them understand that this wasn't rebellion. It was self-preservation. "If you do this," my father said as I headed for the stairs, emotionally exhausted, "don't expect our support. Not financially, not emotionally. The Whitfords have a legacy, and you're either part of it or you're not." I paused on the staircase, my hand gripping the polished banister. "Then I guess I'm not," I said quietly, and continued up to my room. The next week passed in a fog of tense meals and loaded silences. My brother James, home briefly before returning to his analyst position in Manhattan, tried to mediate, but ultimately sided with our parents. "Don't be stupid, Vic," he said, using the nickname he knew I hated. "You're throwing away connections and opportunities people would kill for. For what? To make posters or whatever?" The day I left for Providence was a gray September morning that matched the mood in our house. My mother hugged me stiffly at the door, slipping a check into my hand. "For emergencies only," she whispered. "Your father doesn't know." My father remained in his study, refusing to see me off. James was already back in New York. I loaded my modest luggage into my used Honda Civic, a sharp contrast to the luxury vehicle my parents had planned to gift me for attending Yale, and drove away from the only home I'd ever known, equal parts terrified and exhilarated. Rest was everything I'd dreamed of and more. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who saw the world as I did, in shapes, colors, and possibilities. My industrial design courses challenged me in ways my business classes never had. I stayed up all night working on projects not because I had to, but because I couldn't wait to see them completed. I made friends who valued creativity over conformity, who asked what I thought rather than what my father did for a living. The transition wasn't without difficulties. My parents' financial support had been completely cut off, as promised. The emergency check from my mother covered my first semester's books and supplies, but after that, I was on my own. I took a job at a local coffee shop, working early mornings before classes and weekends while my classmates went to parties. I applied for every scholarship and grant available, writing impassioned essays about my dedication to design. By my sophomore year, I had cobbled together enough financial aid to cover most of my tuition, though I still worked 30 hours a week to pay for my small off-campus apartment and living expenses. The estrangement from my family deepened over time. My calls home went from weekly to monthly to rarely. Each conversation followed the same pattern. My mother's passive-aggressive comments about how James was flourishing at the firm. My father getting on the line briefly to ask if I was done with this nonsense yet. After my sophomore year, I stopped going home for holidays, accepting invitations from friends instead. It hurt, but less than the subtle and not-so-subtle reminders that I was the family disappointment. Despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, I threw myself into my education with an intensity that surprised even me. My professors began to take notice. My junior year project, a sustainable furniture design that transformed for multiple uses in small spaces, won a prestigious student competition. The prize included a summer internship at Lumen Design Group, a cutting-edge firm in San Francisco known for innovative consumer products. That summer in San Francisco changed everything: the creative energy of the city, the collaborative environment at Lumen, the mentorship from established designers who valued my perspective. It all confirmed that I'd made the right choice, despite the personal cost. My internship supervisor, Marcus Chen, became a mentor who pushed me to think beyond conventional approaches. "The design world doesn't need more followers," he told me one late night as we refined prototypes. "It needs people willing to see problems differently." When my internship ended, Marcus offered me a part-time remote position I could balance with my senior year studies. For the first time since leaving home, I felt financially stable, if not comfortable. More importantly, I felt validated in my choice. The path I'd chosen against my family's wishes was yielding exactly the kind of opportunities they'd never believed existed in the creative field. I graduated from RISD with honors and multiple job offers. I accepted a full-time position with Lumen in San Francisco, partly for the creative opportunity and partly for the 3,000 miles it would put between me and Greenwich. I sent my parents and James formal graduation announcements. None of them attended the ceremony. The day after graduation, I received a card from my mother containing a brief note. "Congratulations. I hope you find what you're looking for." And a check for $1,000. It felt less like a gift and more like a final settlement. I cashed it and used the money to help relocate to California, telling myself it was the least they owed me after withdrawing their support. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. San Francisco embraced me in ways Greenwich never had. My design career flourished at Lumen, where I quickly moved from junior designer to project lead on significant accounts. I developed a reputation for user-centered designs that solved real problems while maintaining aesthetic appeal. My name began appearing in industry publications. At 24, I was younger than most of my peers, but advancing faster. It was during a company hackathon that the idea for Adaptive came to me. We'd been challenged to develop concepts addressing unmet needs in remote work environments. While other teams focused on traditional office equipment, I became fascinated with the problems faced by people working from home in small urban apartments, a growing demographic that included me. My concept was simple but revolutionary: modular furniture with embedded technology that could transform small spaces from workplaces to living spaces with minimal effort. Smart surfaces that could shift from desks to dining tables, storage systems that responded to voice commands, lighting that automatically adjusted based on activities. The judges awarded my team first place, but more importantly, Lumen's CEO pulled me aside afterward. "This could be more than a concept, Tori," she said. "Have you considered developing it further?" I hadn't, but her question planted a seed. Over the next 6 months, I refined the concept in my spare time, developing detailed prototypes and a business plan. When I felt it was ready, I applied to Catalyst, Silicon Valley's most competitive startup incubator. The selection process was brutal: multiple rounds of interviews, prototype demonstrations, financial projections. By the final round, I was competing against founders with MBA degrees from Stanford and Harvard, the very credentials my father had insisted were essential. When the acceptance email arrived, I had to read it 3 times before believing it. Catalyst provided the springboard Adaptive needed: seed funding, mentorship, connections to manufacturers and potential investors. I took a leave of absence from Lumen, which turned permanent as Adaptive gained traction. The learning curve was steep. I hadn't studied business, but I learned quickly, supplementing intuition with night classes in entrepreneurship and countless hours of research. Our first production run sold out within weeks. Major tech publications featured our products. Orders poured in faster than our small team could fulfill them. We expanded, hiring engineers and designers who shared my vision for transforming how people lived in small spaces. By the time I turned 26, Adaptive had secured Series A funding of $2.5 million at a valuation that made me, on paper at least, a millionaire. Success didn't heal the rift with my family, though it changed its character. My mother began calling more frequently, her tone softening as she inquired about my little company. My father, hearing about Adaptive's growing profile through business associates, left a stiff voicemail congratulating me on finding a way to make your art commercially viable. James, now a junior partner at Whitford Financial, sent an email suggesting the firm could help manage my newfound assets. Their renewed interest felt too little, too late. The time when I desperately needed their support, emotional more than financial, had passed. I'd built a life without them, surrounded myself with friends and colleagues who valued me for who I was, not who they wanted me to be. While I responded politely to their overtures, I maintained my distance, protective of the independence I'd fought so hard to achieve. Then came the acquisition offer that would change everything. Helix, a global leader in smart home technology, had been watching Adaptive's rise with interest. Their CEO reached out directly, expressing admiration for our innovation and suggesting a partnership. What started as collaboration discussions gradually evolved into acquisition talks. The negotiations lasted months. I insisted on maintaining creative control over product development and protecting jobs for my core team. Helix countered with increasingly attractive financial terms. When the final offer came through, $12 million in cash and stock, with a BOSI 3-year contract for me to head their new Adaptive division, I felt simultaneously elated and terrified. The day the deal closed, I sat alone in my office long after everyone else had left the celebration. I'd achieved a level of success beyond anything I could have imagined when I'd driven away from Greenwich 9 years earlier. The frightened 19-year-old who'd defied her parents to follow her passion had become a 28-year-old woman with validation the business world respected, one my family couldn't dismiss or diminish. I hadn't planned to make the acquisition public beyond necessary industry announcements, but tech news travels fast. Within days, a feature in Tech Innovator magazine included not just the $12 million figure, but a profile highlighting my journey from art school graduate to successful entrepreneur. The article mentioned my estrangement from my prominent East Coast financial family as part of my origin story, painting it as the classic tale of an underdog who proved the doubters wrong. That's when everything changed. The first call came from James, his voice warmer than it had been in years. Vic? Or should I say, Tech Innovator's rising star? Saw the article. Pretty impressive stuff, sis. Listen, I'm coming to San Francisco next month for a conference. We should get dinner, catch up properly. Before I could formulate a response, he continued, and Mom and Dad are really proud, you know. They talk about you all the time. Dad keeps that article about your first funding round on his desk. The revelation struck me as improbable at best, deliberately misleading at worst. My father, who had refused to speak to me directly for years, was suddenly displaying my accomplishments. The same accomplishments he'd predicted would leave me broke and crawling back to Greenwich? That's surprising to hear, I replied carefully, considering Dad made it clear I was no longer part of the family when I chose RESD. James laughed uncomfortably. Water under the bridge, Vic. People say things they don't mean when they're angry. Family is family, right? You can't just erase blood ties. But that's exactly what they had done, erased me when I didn't conform to their expectations. Now that I had acquired validation, they respected, financial success, I was suddenly worth reclaiming. My mother called next, her voice trembling with emotion that seemed genuine. "Victoria, darling, we've missed you so much. Your father and I were just saying yesterday that it's been too long. We'd love to visit you in San Francisco, see this company you've built." The conversation felt surreal, as if we were actors in a play pretending the previous 9 years hadn't happened. When I mentioned the pain of being cut off, she sidestepped with remarkable dexterity. "Families have disagreements, dear. Perhaps we weren't as supportive as we could have been, but we always wanted what was best for you." What was best for me, or what was best for the Whitford image? I wondered silently. Then came the email from my father, the first direct communication from him in nearly 5 years. Formal and businesslike, it congratulated me on the acquisition and suggested that, now that you've established yourself, it might be time to reintegrate with family interests. He proposed a meeting to discuss how my recent liquidity event might be structured for tax advantages through family holdings. No apology, no acknowledgement of the years of silence. Just a transparent attempt to access the wealth I'd created despite, not because of, the Whitford name. The final confirmation of their motives came a week later, when James called again, this time with what he clearly considered an exciting proposition. "I've been thinking," he said, bypassing pleasantries. "This is the perfect time to bring you into the family business after all. Not in the traditional way, obviously. You've proven you have other talents." The condescension was subtle but unmistakable. "But Whitford Financial is expanding into venture capital, targeting design-focused startups. With your experience and connections, you'd be the perfect director for the new division." I let him continue, outlining a role that would essentially leverage my hard-won industry relationships for the firm's benefit while keeping me firmly under the Whitford umbrella. The salary he proposed was generous, though less than I was currently making. The real appeal, he emphasized, was bringing me back into the fold. "Mom and Dad are completely on board," he finished enthusiastically. "Dad's even talking about accelerating his retirement timeline if you join. The prodigal daughter returns, stronger for her time away. It's a narrative everyone would embrace." In that moment, everything crystallized. My successful defiance of their expectations hadn't changed their fundamental view of me. I was still a means to an end, just a potentially more valuable one now. My independence wasn't something they'd learned to respect. It was an inconvenience they were willing to overlook to access my success. "I need to think about it," I said neutrally, ending the call before emotion could overtake my voice. That night, I pulled out a small wooden box I'd kept through every move since leaving home. Inside was the last photo taken of our entire family at James's business school graduation. We stood in a perfect row: father, mother, James in his cap and gown, and me, smiling tensely in a dress my mother had selected. We looked like the ideal family, polished and unified. Only I knew how hollow that image had been, how conditional their love. Next to the photo was the check my mother had slipped me the day I left for RISD, now just a photocopy since I'd cashed the original. "For emergencies only," she'd said. My true emergency had been the years of struggling alone, working, multiple jobs while studying, crying myself to sleep wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. Where had their concern been then? The contrast between their rejection when I'd needed them and their eager reconciliation, now that I had something they wanted, was stark and painful. But it also provided a clarity I hadn't expected. The validation I'd unconsciously sought from them for years, proof that my choices were worthy of respect, wasn't actually necessary. I'd validated myself through my own efforts, surrounded by people who appreciated me for exactly who I was. I set the box aside and opened my laptop. I had decisions to make, boundaries to establish, and a response to craft to my suddenly interested family. Whatever came next would be on my terms, not as the prodigal daughter returning to the fold, but as a woman who had forged her own path and found success on her own definition. The girl who had driven away from Greenwich 9 years ago, terrified, but determined, couldn't have imagined where that journey would lead. But the woman I'd become knew exactly what she was worth, and it had nothing to do with $12 million. I spent the next 3 days considering my response to my family's sudden interest in reconnection. Their timing couldn't have been more transparent. Years of silence broken only after my financial status made headlines. Each time my phone buzzed with a new message from Greenwich, I felt a complex swirl of emotions. Anger at their transparent motives, lingering hurt from their rejection, and beneath it all, a small, stubborn flicker of hope that perhaps they'd genuinely changed. On the 4th day, I made my decision. I wouldn't slam the door in their faces as they had done to me, but neither would I pretend the past 9 years hadn't happened. If they wanted a relationship with me now, it would be on terms that acknowledged both my independence and the pain their rejection had caused. I composed a careful email addressed to all 3 of them. Dear Mom, Dad, and James, I appreciate your recent outreach and interest in reconnecting. After nearly a decade of minimal contact, I find myself needing clarity before proceeding. When I chose to attend RISD instead of Yale, I was told I was no longer part of the family. I respected that decision, even though it caused me significant pain and hardship. I built a life and career without family support, emotional or financial. Your renewed interest comes at a time when my professional success has been widely publicized. While I would like to believe this is coincidental, I find the timing difficult to overlook. I am open to rebuilding relationships, but only with honesty and accountability. I am not interested in joining Whitford Financial or merging my professional life with family interests. If you are sincere about reconnection based on mutual respect for our individual paths, I suggest starting with individual conversations rather than business proposals. Victoria, I pressed send before I could second-guess myself, then turned off my phone and went for a long walk along the San Francisco waterfront. The brisk wind off the bay cleared my head as I reminded myself that I was negotiating from a position of strength. I had crafted a fulfilling life without them. Reconnection would be a choice, not a necessity. My father's response came first, terse and businesslike. Victoria, perhaps we've approached this incorrectly. Business aside, your mother and I would like to visit. We can discuss other matters in person. Your father. No acknowledgement of my concerns. No apology for the years of estrangement. Just a pivot in strategy. Classic Richard Whitford negotiation tactics. My mother's message followed minutes later. Darling Victoria, we've booked flights to San Francisco for next weekend. Your father has meetings on Friday, but we thought we could have dinner that evening and spend Saturday together. Perhaps you could show us your company. We're staying at the Fairmont. We've missed you terribly. Time to put the past behind us. All my love, Mom. The presumption was breathtaking. They had not only ignored my request for individual conversations before a visit, but had already made arrangements, expecting me to accommodate their schedule. Some things hadn't changed. James's response was more direct. Vic, don't overthink this. They're trying. The business stuff was my idea. Thought it might be a natural way to reconnect. Since it's common ground, if you're not interested, fine. But don't punish them for trying to reach out in the only way they know how. They're not perfect, but they're still our parents. Jay. His message rankled most of all. The implication that I was punishing them by setting boundaries, the dismissal of my concerns as overthinking. It was the same dynamic that had existed since childhood. James smoothing things over, making excuses for our parents' behavior, positioning me as the difficult one for having expectations of basic respect. I drafted and deleted a dozen responses before settling on a simple reply to my mother. Mom, I have prior commitments next weekend and won't be available. I'd appreciate more notice for future visits. I'm also not comfortable showing you adaptive. At this time, as my team is still adjusting to the acquisition. When you and Dad are ready to have an honest conversation about the past 9 years, I'm willing to listen. Until then, I think we need to proceed more slowly than you're suggesting. Tori. The use of my preferred name rather than Victoria was deliberate, a small but significant statement that I would no longer conform to their expectations, even in something as simple as what I was called. Their response was a flurry of calls and messages expressing concern about my coldness and questioning whether I was still holding on to old grievances. My father even suggested that my resistance to family reconciliation might indicate I wasn't handling success well. The gaslighting was so familiar it was almost comical. I held firm. I didn't answer the calls, responding only with text messages reiterating my boundaries. When they pushed, I stepped back further. When they demanded, I offered less. It was a dynamic they weren't accustomed to, a daughter who couldn't be manipulated through guilt or obligation. After a week of this stalemate, I received an unexpected call from my Aunt Diana, my father's younger sister. Diana was the family outlier, a professor of anthropology who had chosen academia over the family business, resulting in a strained relationship with my father. We'd been close during my childhood, but contact had dwindled after my estrangement from the family. "Tori," she said warmly when I answered, "it's been too long." "Diana, this is a surprise. A good one, I hope. I've been following your success from afar. That furniture system you designed for micro apartments? Brilliant solution to urban living constraints." The fact that she referenced my actual work rather than just the acquisition price marked her immediately as different from the rest of the family. "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched. "How did you get my number?" "Eleanor gave it to me, reluctantly." There was a hint of amusement in her voice. "I understand there's been some family drama rekindled." "You could say that. Suddenly everyone wants to be part of my life again now that you've proven your father catastrophically wrong about your career choice," she finished. Classic Richard. He never could admit a mistake. Her candor was refreshing after the carefully calculated messages from my parents and brother. "They want to visit," I said. "Act like nothing happened. James is trying to recruit me for the family firm. It's like they think my success erases the fact that they cut me off completely." Diana sighed. "The Whitfords have always excelled at rewriting history to suit the current narrative. Your grandfather was the master of it. Your father learned from the best." "What should I do?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. "That depends on what you want, Tori. If you're hoping for a tearful apology and acknowledgement of how wrong they were, you'll be waiting forever. Richard physically cannot admit failure. I'm convinced it would cause him actual pain." "I'm not expecting miracles," I said. "Just some basic honesty about what happened." "Then you'll need to force the issue," Diana said. "The Whitfords respond to strength, not appeals to emotion. They're trying to dictate the terms of reconciliation. Don't let them." After we hung up, I considered Diana's advice. She was right. My family was approaching this reconnection like a business negotiation, attempting to set the terms from a position of assumed authority. But they no longer held power over me, financial or otherwise. If reconciliation was going to happen, it would be on mutually agreeable terms, or not at all. I decided to take control of the situation. Instead of continuing the back and forth via email and text, I would bring the discussion into the open. I sent a new message to all, 3 of them. I propose a video call this Sunday at 1 p.m. Pacific Time to discuss the possibility of rebuilding our relationship. If we can have an honest conversation about the past and establish mutual respect for the future, I'm open to planning an in-person visit. If that's not possible, we should acknowledge that reconciliation may not be feasible at this time. They agreed, though not without my father noting that he would need to leave after 30 minutes for another commitment. Even in this, he was establishing that I wasn't a priority. Sunday arrived, and at precisely 1 p.m., I connected to the call. They appeared on my screen seated in the formal living room of our Greenwich home, the same room where I'd announced my decision to attend RISD 9 years earlier. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. They looked older, of course. My father's hair had gone completely gray, and deeper lines framed my mother's carefully made-up face. James looked essentially the same, perhaps a bit heavier, wearing the Whitford man's uniform of button-down Oxford shirt and blazer even for a Sunday call. "Victoria!" My mother began with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How wonderful to see you! You look! California certainly agrees with you." I knew what she wasn't saying. My appearance had changed significantly since Greenwich. Gone was the preppy wardrobe she'd selected. I now dressed in the creative professional style of San Francisco tech culture. My once long hair was cut in a modern asymmetrical style, and I'd added a small nose stud, a tiny act of rebellion during my second year at RISD that had become a signature part of my look. "It's good to see you all too," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I appreciate you making time for this conversation." "Of course," my father said brusquely. "Though as I mentioned, I have a limited window today." "Then let's not waste time," I replied. "I want to be direct about why I've been hesitant to jump into reconciliation. For 9 years, I heard almost nothing from any of you. The message was clear. Because I chose a path you didn't approve of, I was no longer part of the family. Now that my company has been acquired for a significant sum, suddenly there's interest in reconnecting. You can understand why that seems conditional at best, opportunistic at worst." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother fiddled with her pearls, her nervous tell. James looked uncomfortable. My father's expression hardened into the controlled mask I remembered from childhood disagreements. "That's a rather harsh assessment," my father finally said. "Families have disagreements. You chose to move across the country." "After you told me I was no longer part of the family," I reminded him. "Your exact words, Dad." "People say things in anger they don't mean," my mother interjected, her tone placating. "We were surprised and hurt by your decision. Perhaps we reacted poorly." "Perhaps?" I raised an eyebrow. "What do you want, Victoria?" my father asked sharply. "An apology? Fine. We're sorry we didn't support your unconventional choice. We see now that it worked out for you, against all odds. Can we move forward now?" His non-apology was so perfectly in character that I almost laughed. Against all odds was particularly rich, the implication that my success was some fluke rather than the result of talent and hard work. "I don't want a forced apology, Dad. I want honesty. You cut me off because I didn't conform to your plan for my life. You're reaching out now because my success has made me valuable to you again, specifically to the family business. I'm willing to rebuild a relationship, but only if we can acknowledge these facts rather than pretending the estrangement was some minor disagreement that just happened to last nearly a decade." James jumped in, clearly trying to mediate. "Look, Vic, what's the point of rehashing old wounds? We're reaching out now. Isn't that what matters?" "Timing matters," I replied. "Motivation matters. I built my entire career and company without a single word of encouragement from any of you. Not one call during finals week, not one visit when I was working 3 jobs to stay in school, not one congratulations when I got my first design patent. The only thing that's changed is that I now have something you want, connections in the tech industry and new wealth." "That's unfair," my mother protested. "We've always loved you. We just didn't understand your choices." I took a deep breath, reminding myself that my goal wasn't to punish them, but to establish truth as the foundation for any future relationship. "I believe you love me in your way," I conceded. "But that love has always been conditional on me being who you wanted me to be. I need to know if that's changed, or if you're just making an exception because my success has come in a form you recognize as valuable." My father glanced at his watch. a gesture so dismissive that it clarified everything for me. This call, this reconciliation, wasn't a priority for him. It was an item to check off his list before moving on to more important matters. "I think we're going in circles," he said. "We've acknowledged that mistakes were made on both sides. We're reaching out to make amends. Either you're interested in moving forward or you're not." "Both sides," I repeated. "What exactly was my mistake, Dad? Pursuing a career I was passionate about and talented in? Building a successful company? Or just not doing it your way?" "Your mistake was rejecting family legacy and responsibility," he shot back, his composure finally cracking. "The Whitford name means something in our circles. For generations, we've maintained a certain position, certain connections. You threw that away for—" He waved his hand dismissively. "Furniture design." There it was. The truth beneath the veneer of reconciliation. 9 years later, he still fundamentally believed I had made the wrong choice. My success was irrelevant. My crime was independence from the Whitford master plan. "Richard," my mother murmured warningly, placing a hand on his arm. "No, Eleanor," he brushed her off. "If Victoria wants honesty, she can have it. Yes, your financial success has made us reconsider the situation. It proves you're not the impractical dreamer we feared. You'd become. That's a good thing. It means you've shown the Whitford business acumen after all, just in a different industry. We're willing to overlook the past because you've demonstrated value." "Demonstrated value," I repeated slowly. "Like a stock investment that's finally showing returns." "That's not what he meant," James interjected quickly. "It's exactly what he meant," I replied. "And I appreciate the honesty, Dad. It clarifies things." My father checked his watch again. "I need to go. Eleanor, wrap this up. Victoria, think about what's being offered here. A return to family, access to our connections and resources. Don't let pride keep you isolated." With that, he stood and walked off screen, leaving my mother and James looking uncomfortable. "He doesn't express himself well when it comes to emotions," my mother said after a moment. "He does miss you, in his way." "His way being that he now sees potential business advantage in reconnecting," I said. "Mom, I understand this is difficult, but I need you to understand something. I'm not isolated. I have a fulfilling life, meaningful work, and close friends who value me for exactly who I am. What I don't have is family, but that was your choice, not mine." "And we're trying to rectify that," James said, an edge of frustration in his voice. "Why can't you meet us halfway?" "Because halfway would still leave me compromising my dignity," I replied. "I'm willing to rebuild a relationship, but not one based on my usefulness to Whitford Financial or conditional on me fitting back into the family mold." My mother's expression softened slightly. "What would rebuilding look like to you then?" It was the first genuine question any of them had asked. What I wanted rather than what they expected. I felt a small opening, a crack in the Whitford facade. It would start with respect for my separate life and career. No more attempts to recruit me for the family business. No expectation that I'll conform to Greenwich standards again. And most importantly, real acknowledgement of how profoundly hurtful the estrangement was, not just glossing over it like an unfortunate misunderstanding. James looked skeptical, but my mother nodded slowly. "I can't speak for your father, but I can tell you that I regret how things unfolded. I should have been stronger, more supportive. When you left, I told myself it was just a phase, that you'd come back once you realized how difficult your chosen path would be. When you didn't, when you succeeded instead, I didn't know how to bridge the gap without admitting how wrong we'd been." Her candor caught me off guard. It wasn't a complete acknowledgement, but it was more honest than anything I'd heard from her in years. "Thank you for saying that," I said quietly. "It means a lot." "So what now?" James asked, still looking, uncomfortable with the emotional direction of the conversation. "Now we try something new," I suggested. "Instead of grand gestures or immediate family reunions, we start small. Regular calls. Getting to know each other as the adults we are now, not the people we were 9 years ago. No pressure, no expectations, just communication. And if there's a family gathering, a holiday or special occasion, would you consider attending?" my mother asked hesitantly. I considered this. Eventually, yes, but not until we've established a foundation of mutual respect. "Your father may take time to adjust to this approach," she warned. "I know. I'm not expecting miracles. I'm just asking for authenticity." As the call ended, I felt a curious mixture of emotions: sadness for the years lost, cautious hope for what might be possible, and most surprisingly, a profound sense of peace. For the first time since leaving Greenwich, I had engaged with my family not as the desperate daughter seeking approval, but as a woman secure in her own worth, setting boundaries that honored her journey. That evening, I walked to my favorite spot in the city, a hilltop park with a panoramic view of the bay. As the sun set behind the Golden Gate Bridge, painting the sky in dramatic oranges and pinks, I reflected on how far I'd come from that terrified 19-year-old driving away from everything familiar. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been moments of crushing doubt, nights spent questioning whether I'd made a catastrophic mistake, days when the weight of doing everything alone had seemed unbearable. But those struggles had forged something precious, an unshakable confidence in my own resilience and capacity to create a life aligned with my true self. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "I've been thinking about our conversation. You're right that we need to rebuild slowly. Would you be open to a regular Sunday call, just the two of us?" It was a small step, but perhaps the beginning of something authentic. I typed back, "Sunday evenings work for me. Looking forward to it." As I slipped my phone back into my pocket, I realized something profound. The $12 million acquisition hadn't changed my life nearly as much as that first courageous decision to drive away from Greenwich and choose my own path. The true fortune wasn't in my bank account, but in the freedom I'd fought for. The liberty to define success on my own terms and surround myself with people who celebrated, rather than merely tolerated, my differences. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt water and eucalyptus, smells that had become home to me in a way Connecticut's manicured landscapes never had. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the air of the life I'd chosen. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Integrating Adaptive's team with Helix's corporate structure, navigating this tentative reconnection with my family, continuing to grow as a designer and leader. But tonight, watching the city lights begin to twinkle across the bay, I was simply grateful for the courage of that younger self who had dared to imagine a different kind of life than the one prescribed for her. She had no idea where her defiance would lead, the hardships she would face or the success she would achieve. She only knew she had to be true to herself, even at tremendous cost. In honoring that decision now, in refusing to allow my family to diminish or rewrite that journey, I was honoring not just who I'd become, but who I'd always been beneath the Whitford expectations. A woman with the courage to define her own path, whatever obstacles might stand in her way. The tentative reconnection with my family progressed slowly over the following months. My Sunday evening calls with my mother became a regular fixture, awkward at first, with conversation limited to safe topics like the weather in our respective cities or neutral childhood memories. Gradually, we began to venture into more meaningful territory. She shared her volunteer work with the Greenwich Historical Society, a passion she'd developed after my father's semi-retirement had freed her from some of her social obligations. I told her about my design challenges at Helix, where integrating Adaptive's creative culture with corporate protocols sometimes felt like trying to mix oil and water. My father remained largely absent from these tentative reconciliation efforts. He'd join my mother on the call for a few perfunctory minutes before claiming a pressing engagement elsewhere. James was more consistent, reaching out weekly with brief text messages that slowly evolved from business-focused to occasionally personal. He sent a photo of his new boat, asked my opinion on a vacation property he was considering in the Berkshires, shared news of his promotion to senior partner. While these communications maintained a careful distance from deeper emotions, they represented more connection than I'd had with my family in years. I approached this gradual thawing with cautious optimism, careful to maintain my boundaries while remaining open to genuine change. Meanwhile, my professional life presented challenges that demanded my full attention. The acquisition by Helix had thrust me into a corporate environment vastly different from the startup culture I'd built at Adaptive. Suddenly, I was navigating layers of approval for decisions I'd previously made independently, explaining my design philosophy to executives primarily concerned with quarterly earnings, and fighting to preserve my team's creative approach while integrating with Helix's systems. "They just don't get it," I vented to Marcus, my former mentor who had become a close friend and occasional advisor. We were having dinner at a small bistro near my Potrero Hill apartment, a monthly tradition we'd maintained since my Lumen days. They keep talking about scaling efficiencies and standardized components, which completely misses what makes our products special. Marcus nodded sympathetically. At 58, with decades of experience navigating corporate acquisitions of design firms, he'd seen this pattern before. The honeymoon phase is ending. Now comes the real marriage, where you figure out if you're truly compatible or if you're just tolerating each other for the benefits. I sighed, twirling pasta around my fork. The irony isn't lost on me. I left my family because they couldn't accept my creative path, built a company that validated that path, and now I'm fighting the same battle with Helix. With one crucial difference, Marcus pointed out. Now you have leverage, a successful product line, a loyal team, and financial independence. Your family had power over you. With Helix, you're more of an equal partner, even if it doesn't always feel that way. He was right. The acquisition agreement had been structured to give me significant autonomy as division head for 3 years. I had capital, credibility, and options that my 19-year-old self could never have imagined. The realization was both empowering and sobering, a reminder of how far I'd come and the responsibility that came with my position. "Speaking of family," Marcus said, changing the subject, "how's that complicated reunion progressing?" Slowly, cautiously. My mother is trying in her way. My father still treats our relationship like a business transaction he's not particularly invested in. James, keeping the peace, smoothing things over, never quite taking a stand. "And how are you feeling about it all?" I considered the question, appreciating Marcus's characteristic directness. Conflicted. Part of me still wants what I've always wanted, their unconditional acceptance and support. Another part remembers too clearly how conditional their love was and remains skeptical that anything has fundamentally changed. The dance of family? Reconciliation, Marcus mused. Figuring out how much of the past to forgive, how much to forget, and what boundaries to maintain going forward. Exactly. And the $12 million elephant in the room doesn't help. Every time my father mentions a family investment opportunity, or James brings up leveraging synergies between my tech connections and Whitford Financial, I'm reminded of why they reached out now after all this time. Marcus studied me thoughtfully. You know, Tori, one of your greatest strengths as a designer is your ability to see problems from multiple perspectives, to understand user needs even when they're not explicitly stated. Maybe it's worth applying that same skill to your family situation. What do you mean? Their approaches may be clumsy and self-interested, but is it possible they're also expressing something they don't know how to articulate directly? Your father's business proposals could be his way of saying, I respect what you've built. Your brother's networking suggestions might be his attempt to create common ground. I'd never considered this perspective. My family's financial focus had always seemed like a limitation, their inability to value anything beyond monetary success. But what if it was also their language, the only vocabulary they had to express more complex emotions? That's actually insightful, I admitted, though it doesn't excuse 9 years of silence. Of course not, Marcus agreed. I'm not suggesting you abandon your boundaries or standards. Just that understanding their limitations might help. You navigate the relationship without constantly being disappointed or hurt by their inability to connect in the ways you might prefer. Our conversation shifted to other topics, but Marcus's observation lingered in my mind. Over the next few weeks, I found myself listening differently during my calls with my mother and the occasional brief exchanges with my father. I began to notice patterns, how my mother asked detailed questions about my apartment's design and furniture choices, her way of connecting with my professional world, how my father, uncomfortable with direct emotional expression, would occasionally mention he'd seen adaptive products featured in business publications, his version of expressing pride. These weren't the full-throated affirmations I might have wished for, but they were attempts at connection within the constraints of who they were. Recognizing this didn't erase the hurt of the past, but it did help me approach our tentative reconciliation with more patience and less reactivity. In late October, just as San Francisco's brief autumn was giving way to the rainy season, I received an unexpected call from my mother. It was a Wednesday afternoon, not our usual Sunday time, and her voice carried an unusual note of excitement. Tori, she corrected herself, still adjusting to my preference. I have news. Your grandmother Whitford is turning 90 in December. My paternal grandmother, Eleanor Whitford Sr., was a formidable woman who had been the backbone of the family's social standing while my grandfather built the financial firm. Though traditional in many ways, she had always shown more interest in my artistic inclinations than my parents had, sending me art supplies for birthdays and asking to see my sketchbooks during family visits. That's wonderful, I replied. Please, give her my best wishes. Actually, my mother continued, we're planning a significant celebration at the Greenwich Country Club on December 18th. The entire extended family will attend, along with close friends and business associates. Your grandmother has specifically asked if you would come. I hesitated, caught off guard by the invitation. A formal family event would be a significant escalation from our cautious phone reconciliation, throwing me back into the entire Whitford social circle at once, with all the complicated dynamics that entailed. I understand if it feels too soon, my mother added quickly, interpreting my silence. But she asks about you often. I think it would mean a great deal to her to have you there. My grandmother had been one of the few family members who had maintained occasional contact after my departure, sending birthday cards with brief but warm notes, never pressuring me to return but leaving the door open. While our communication had dwindled over time, I'd always appreciated that she, alone among the Whitfords, had seemed to respect my choice even if she didn't fully understand it. Let me check my schedule, I said, not ready to commit immediately. Things are quite busy with the Helix integration. Of course, my mother replied, though I could hear the disappointment in her voice. Just let me know soon so we can make the appropriate arrangements if you're able to attend. After we hung up, I paced my apartment, weighing the invitation. Returning to Greenwich would mean facing not just my immediate family, but the entire social circle that had defined my childhood. Distant relatives who had likely heard only my parents' version of events, family friends who had watched me grow up and then disappear, business associates who might now view me through the lens of my acquisition success. The prospect was daunting, stirring up insecurities I thought I'd left behind. Would I be viewed as the prodigal daughter returning in triumph, or the family oddity who'd rejected tradition? Would I feel compelled to defend my choices or prove my success? Would old patterns resurface, pulling me back into the role of the disappointing daughter despite all I'd accomplished? I called Lynn, my closest friend in San Francisco and former adaptive operations director who had joined me at Helix. As someone who had witnessed my journey from struggling RISD graduate to successful entrepreneur, she understood the complexities of my family situation without the baggage of having been involved in it. "A family reunion at the Greenwich Country Club," she mused after I explained the situation. "Sounds like the setting for either a heartwarming Hallmark movie or a psychological thriller, depending on how it goes." I laughed despite my anxiety. "That's exactly it. I can't decide if this is a genuine opportunity for healing or setting myself up for more disappointment." "What does your gut tell you about your grandmother's request specifically?" Lynn asked. "Do you think that's coming from a sincere place?" I considered this. Yes, actually. She was always different from the rest of them, more accepting, less fixated on the family reputation. She sent me a lovely note when the acquisition news broke, just saying she was proud of me. No mentions of money or business opportunities, just genuine pride. "That's meaningful," Lynn observed, "and 90 is significant. If you don't go and later regret it?" She didn't need to finish the thought. My grandmother was the one family member I had no unresolved resentment toward. The idea of disappointing her or missing this milestone celebration didn't sit right with me. "I think I need to go," I said slowly, "but on my own terms. Not slipping back into their world as if the past 9 years never happened, but showing up as who I am now. The successful designer and entrepreneur who doesn't need their approval anymore," Lynn added with a smile. "The woman who wears a nose stud to a country club." Exactly. The decision crystallized as I spoke. I'll go to honor my grandmother and to show them, and maybe myself, that I can engage with that world without being diminished by it. That I can love my family without needing to become who they want me to be. The next day, I called my mother to accept the invitation, setting clear parameters. I would attend for the weekend of the celebration only, would stay at the local hotel rather than the family home, and would need to return to San Francisco immediately after due to work commitments. She accepted these conditions without protest, seeming genuinely pleased that I would attend. As the date approached, my apprehension grew. I found myself obsessing over details I would normally consider trivial: what to wear, how to style my hair, whether to keep or remove my nose stud for the event. These superficial concerns masked deeper anxieties about identity and belonging. I wanted to present authentically as the woman I'd become while still showing respect for the occasion and my grandmother. Lynn helped me select an outfit that threaded this needle, a beautifully tailored charcoal gray suit from a sustainable San Francisco designer, modernized with a subtle asymmetrical cut that was professional but distinctly non-traditional. I would pair it with my mother's pearl earrings, the one piece of family jewelry I'd kept, a symbolic bridge between my heritage and my current identity. 2 weeks before the event, I received a text from James. "Hearing lots of buzz about you coming to grandmother's party. Fair warning, Dad's invited some key investors who are interested in meeting you. Nothing formal, just FYI." The message triggered immediate tension. Despite our discussions about boundaries, my father was apparently planning to use my presence as a business opportunity. I crafted and deleted several angry responses before settling on, "Thanks for the heads up. I'm coming to celebrate grandmother, not to network. Please make that clear to Dad." James's reply came quickly. "Already tried. You know how he is. Just giving you advance notice so you're not blindsided." I appreciated James's warning, even as I resented the situation that necessitated it. My brother had always occupied a complex position in our family dynamic. The compliant son who fulfilled expectations while occasionally trying to buffer me from the worst of our parents' pressure. He'd never openly defied our father as I had, but in small ways, he sometimes tried to mitigate the damage. The week before my departure for Greenwich, I prepared meticulously both professionally and emotionally. I cleared my calendar for the days surrounding the trip, delegated ongoing projects to trusted team members, and scheduled extra sessions with my therapist, Dr. Chen, no relation to Marcus, who had helped me navigate the complex emotions around my family estrangement and subsequent tentative reconciliation. "What's your biggest fear about this trip?" Dr. Chen asked during our final session before my departure. I considered the question carefully. That I'll revert to old patterns, that despite everything I've built and become, in their presence, I'll somehow shrink back into the insecure daughter seeking approval. And your hope? That I can be fully myself, the woman I've become, while still connecting with them. That we might begin building something new based on who we all are now, not who we were or who they wanted me to be. Dr. Chen nodded. Those are clarifying intentions. When you feel yourself being pulled back into old dynamics, reconnect with the woman who built Adaptive, who leads a division at Helix, who has created a life aligned with her values. She doesn't need their validation anymore, which paradoxically makes authentic connection possible. The morning of my flight to New York, I stood in my apartment looking at the small suitcase I'd packed for the 3-day trip. The physical lightness of my baggage contrasted with the emotional weight of the journey ahead. I touched the nose stud I'd decided to keep in, a small but meaningful statement of authenticity, and headed to the airport. Landing at JFK felt surreal. The last time I'd been in New York was 9 years earlier, a brief stopover on my drive from Greenwich to Providence, my car packed with the belongings that would start my new life. Now I was returning not as a defiant teenager, but as a successful adult, by choice rather than necessity. I'd arranged for a rental car rather than accepting my parents' offer of a driver, another small assertion of independence. The familiar landscape of Connecticut unfolded along the highway, the manicured suburbs, the glimpses of Long Island Sound, the increasing opulence of homes as I approached Greenwich. The town itself appeared frozen in time, its upscale shopping district and carefully preserved colonial architecture unchanged since my youth. The Delamar Hotel overlooked Greenwich Harbor, its elegant facade a stark contrast to the boutique hotels I preferred in San Francisco. As the valet took my rental car, I caught sight of my reflection in the hotel's glass doors. Designer suit, confident posture, the woman I'd become superimposed against the backdrop of my past. The juxtaposition was jarring, but affirming. I'd changed, even if Greenwich hadn't. After checking in, I found a voicemail from my mother. "We'd love to have you join us for dinner this evening, if you're not too tired from your flight. Just the family at home. Nothing formal." I considered declining, preserving my emotional energy for the main event tomorrow. But postponing the initial reunion would only prolong my anxiety. Better to have the first encounter in a relatively private setting before the public celebration. I called back and accepted, arranging to meet them at 7 p.m. The hours until then stretched before me. On impulse, I decided to visit some places from my earlier life, a personal pilgrimage to measure the distance between then and now. My first stop was Greenwich Academy, the private girls' school I'd attended from kindergarten through graduation. School was in session, so I couldn't go inside, but I parked across the street, studying the red brick buildings and manicured grounds where I'd spent my formative years. So much of who I'd become had been shaped in opposition to the values instilled here. The emphasis on conformity, on fulfilling predetermined roles, on success defined by narrow parameters. Yet looking back with adult perspective, I could also appreciate what this education had given me: analytical thinking, articulate communication, the confidence to move in rarefied circles that had later helped me navigate venture capital meetings and acquisition negotiations. My success had come from integrating these skills with the creativity and authenticity I'd fought so hard to preserve, not from rejecting everything associated with my upbringing. From the academy, I drove to Bruce Park, where I'd often escaped. As a teenager, sketchbook in hand, finding quiet spots to draw away from my parents' scrutiny. The fall colors were at their peak, the maple trees blazing red and orange against a clear blue sky. I walked familiar paths, remembering the girl who had sat on these benches dreaming of a different life, never imagining exactly how that dream would manifest. As afternoon faded toward evening, I returned to the hotel to prepare for dinner. Changing into a more casual but still polished outfit, dark jeans, a cashmere sweater, and the simple gold necklace Lynn had given me when we closed the acquisition deal, I steeled myself for the evening ahead. I was no longer seeking approval, I reminded myself. I was engaging as an equal, open to connection, but no longer dependent on it for my sense of self-worth. The drive to the Whitford family home in Belhaven took less than 15 minutes. As I turned onto the private lane lined with mature oak trees, each in its perfect autumn splendor, memories cascaded through me, running down this drive as a child, learning to ride a bike with my father's steady hand on the seat, leaving for my senior prom in a gown my mother had selected, driving away that final morning with tears streaming down my face. The house itself appeared exactly as I remembered. A stately colonial revival with white columns flanking the front entrance, meticulously maintained gardens now prepared for winter, warm light spilling from multiple windows. I sat in my car, for a moment, gathering my composure, then walked to the front door. Before I could ring the bell, the door swung open. My mother stood in the entrance, wearing a subtle cloud of Chanel No. 5 and an expression hovering between anxiety and joy. "Victoria," she said, then immediately corrected herself. "Tori, you're here." "Hi, Mom." The words felt strange in my mouth after so many years. She stepped forward hesitantly, then embraced me. The hug was awkward but genuine, neither of us quite remembering the physical language of mother and daughter, after so long apart. "Let me look at you," she said, stepping back. Her eyes moved over me, taking in the nose stud, the modern haircut, the confident posture that hadn't been present when I left. "You look strong, assured." From anyone else, these might have seemed like odd compliments, but from Eleanor Whitford, who had spent her life embodying Greenwich's ideals of feminine refinement and restraint, they represented a significant acknowledgement. "Thank you," I replied simply. "It's strange to be back." "I imagine so." She hesitated, then added, "We're glad you came. Your grandmother is particularly excited to see you tomorrow." She led me into the house through the formal foyer with its sweeping staircase and into the living room where my father and James waited. The room was unchanged. The same antique furniture, oil paintings of stern Whitford ancestors, shelves of leather-bound books more decorative than functional. It was like walking into a museum of my former life. My father stood as we entered, his posture straight, expression inscrutable. 9 years had added more gray to his hair and deepened the lines around his eyes, but otherwise, Richard Whitford remained the commanding presence I remembered. Brooks Brothers suit even for a family. Dinner, Yale class ring catching the light as he extended his hand toward me. A handshake, not a hug. Typical. "Victoria," he said formally. "Welcome home." I took his hand briefly. "Thank you for having me. And it's Tori now, as I'm sure Mom mentioned." A flicker of disapproval crossed his face at the correction, quickly, masked. "Of course, Tori. Your flight was satisfactory?" Before I could answer this stilted question, James approached, breaking the tension with a warmth neither of our parents could manage. "The prodigal sister returns," he said with a grin, pulling me into a brief but genuine hug. Though I guess technically, the prodigal is supposed to come back broke and humbled, not as a tech success story. "James," my mother admonished, but I laughed, appreciating his attempt to acknowledge the awkwardness of the situation. Definitely failed the broken humbled part of the story, I agreed. Sorry to disappoint. Drinks before dinner? My father suggested, moving to the bar cart that had occupied the same corner of the living room throughout my childhood. Your usual white wine, Victoria? Tori? I was surprised he remembered. Yes, thank you. As he poured drinks with practiced precision, scotch for himself, gin and tonic for my mother, bourbon for James, I took in the subtle changes to the room. New photographs had appeared on the piano, James in fishing gear holding an impressive catch, my parents at what appeared to be a charity gala, an elderly woman I recognized as my grandmother surrounded by people at a garden party. No photos of me, but that was hardly surprising given our estrangement. A toast, my father said once we all held drinks, to family reunited. We clinked glasses, the ritual so familiar it created an odd sense of temporal displacement, as if the past 9 years might have been a dream, and I'd never left at all. But the woman holding the wine glass was not the same one who had driven away at 19, and pretending otherwise would serve none of us. So, James said as we settled into our seats, exciting times at Helix? The integration going smoothly? A safe topic, business, the Whitford comfort zone. It has its challenges, I replied honestly. Bringing an innovative startup culture into a corporate environment always does. But the fundamental vision remains intact, which is what matters most to me. Your furniture systems were featured in Architectural Digest last month, my mother commented. The piece about urban living solutions, very impressive. I looked at her in surprise. You saw that? I have a Google alert set up for your name, she admitted, a faint flush coloring her cheeks. I've been following your career for years, even when we weren't in contact. The revelation stunned me. I'd assumed they'd ignored my professional progress until the acquisition had made financial news. The idea that my mother had been quietly tracking my development all along added a new dimension to our estrangement. Not complete disinterest, but distant observation. The technology integration in those pieces is remarkably sophisticated, my father added unexpectedly. One of our clients has your system in their Manhattan apartment. The engineering behind the transformation mechanisms is quite ingenious. Another surprise, not just awareness of my work, but specific knowledge about its technical aspects. Before I could respond, a uniformed housekeeper appeared at the doorway. Dinner is served, Mrs. Whitford, she announced. We moved to the formal dining room, where the massive mahogany table had been set for 4, though it could comfortably seat 16. Growing up, this room had been used only for important dinner parties or holiday gatherings. Family meals typically took place in the smaller breakfast room. The formal setting highlighted the significance they placed on this reunion. As we took our seats, my father at the head of the table, my mother to his right, James and I across from each other, I was struck by how completely the choreography of Whitford family life had been preserved in my absence. The same china pattern, the same silver service, the same expectation that conversation would remain pleasant and substantive without veering into emotionally challenging territory. Yet beneath this familiar veneer, subtle shifts were occurring. My mother asked thoughtful questions about my design process. James shared anecdotes about his work that invited my perspective rather than showcasing his accomplishments. Even my father, though still formal, made occasional comments that suggested he had developed genuine respect for what I'd built, however reluctantly. As dessert was served, my grandmother's famous apple tart, prepared in her honor though she wouldn't be joining us until tomorrow, my father cleared his throat in the way that had always preceded an important proclamation. Tori, he began, the use of my preferred name clearly deliberate. I owe you an acknowledgement. I set down my fork, startled by this unexpected opening. When you chose to pursue design rather than business, I believed you were making a grave mistake. I was convinced you were sacrificing security and status for an impractical dream." He paused, his discomfort with emotional directness evident in his stiff posture. I was wrong. The admission hung in the air between us, as unexpected as if the chandelier had suddenly spoken. Richard Whitford did not admit mistakes. Not to business associates, not to family, perhaps not even to himself. "You've built something significant entirely on your own terms," he continued. "While I still believe you could have achieved success through more traditional channels, I can no longer deny that your path has proven viable. Perhaps even optimal, given your specific talents." It wasn't a warm, emotional apology. It didn't directly address the pain of rejection or the years of estrangement. But coming from my father, this acknowledgement represented a seismic shift, perhaps the closest he could come to admitting the human cost of his rigid expectations. "Thank you for saying that," I replied carefully. "It means a lot to hear you acknowledge that different paths can lead to meaningful success." He nodded once, decisively, as if closing a business negotiation. "Your grandmother always insisted you had a unique vision that would find its proper application. It appears she was right, as she so often is." My mother reached across the table to briefly touch my hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We're very proud of what you've accomplished, Tori, and I'm sorry we weren't there to support you along the way." The directness of her apology, contrasting with my father's more oblique acknowledgement, caught me off guard. For 9 years, I'd imagined this moment. My parents recognizing the pain their rejection had caused, validating the path I'd chosen. Now that it was happening, I found myself unexpectedly emotional, a complex mixture of vindication, grief for what we'd lost, and cautious hope for what might still be possible. "Thank you," I said simply, not trusting myself to say more without my voice breaking. James raised his wineglass. "To finding our way back to each other," he offered, "however long it takes." As we clinked glasses for the second time that evening, I realized that while the formal structure of Whitford family life remained, something fundamental had shifted. We were no longer performing our prescribed roles in a predetermined script. We were 4 adults with a complicated shared history, tentatively exploring whether that history could evolve into a different kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than conformity to expectations. The evening ended earlier than I'd anticipated, my parents sensitive to my jet lag after the cross-country flight. As I prepared to leave, my mother walked me to the door. "Will you be comfortable at the hotel?" she asked. "Your room is still available if you'd prefer to stay here." The offer touched me, but I shook my head. "The hotel is perfect for this visit. Maybe next time." I left the possibility open, a small concession to her evident hope for greater reconnection. "Tomorrow will be quite the event," she said. "Your grandmother has insisted on a proper celebration with all the trimmings. The entire extended family will be there. Your Uncle Robert from Boston, the cousins from Philadelphia, everyone." "I look forward to seeing grandmother," I replied diplomatically, not mentioning my apprehension about facing the wider family circle after so long. "She talks about you constantly," my mother said unexpectedly. "Shows everyone those articles about your designs, the interview you did for that technology magazine. She has a scrapbook." She hesitated, then added, "She never gave up on you coming back to us eventually. Never stopped believing there was room for a different kind of Whitford." The image of my grandmother maintaining this connection to me, quietly championing my alternative path within the traditional family, brought a lump to my throat. Perhaps tomorrow's celebration was more than a social obligation. Perhaps it was an opportunity to honor not just my grandmother's 90 years, but also her vision of family, broad enough to embrace difference alongside tradition. As I drove back to the hotel through the quiet streets of Greenwich, I reflected on the evening, not perfect, not without tension, but far better than I had dared to hope. The acknowledgement from my father, though characteristically restrained, represented a fundamental shift in how he viewed my choices. My mother's more direct apology suggested a willingness to engage honestly with our shared past rather than glossing over painful truths. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges: the wider family circle, my father's invited business associates, the social dynamics of Greenwich's elite. But tonight had given me reason to believe that returning to Greenwich didn't have to mean reverting to old patterns or diminishing who I'd become. Perhaps it was possible to honor my roots while remaining true to the person I'd fought to become, to find connection without compromise. Back in my hotel room, I messaged Lynn. First family dinner in 9 years complete. Still standing. Actually, maybe even standing taller. Her reply came quickly. Never doubted it. You built a life from scratch once. Rebuilding a relationship on your terms should be easy by comparison. I smiled at her confidence, setting my phone aside and looking out at the marina lights reflecting on the dark harbor waters. Tomorrow would bring the formal celebration, my public reintroduction to Whitford society. But tonight had been the real test, and in unexpected ways, we had all risen to meet it. The journey wasn't complete. Genuine reconciliation would require more than one dinner conversation, but for the first time, it seemed possible that my family might eventually accept me fully for who I was, rather than who they'd planned for me to be. Not because I'd compromised my path to earn their approval, but because my unwavering commitment to that path had ultimately forced them to expand their definition of success. As I prepared for bed, I caught sight of myself in the hotel mirror, the woman I'd become reflected against the backdrop of where I'd begun. The contrast was striking, but no longer painful. I had needed to leave Greenwich to discover who I truly was, but perhaps returning, briefly and on my own terms, was part of integrating that discovery into a complete identity, one that honored both my independence and my heritage. Tomorrow would bring its own revelations. For tonight, it was enough to know that the courage I'd shown at 19 hadn't just built a successful career, but had created the possibility of a more authentic family connection than I'd ever experienced before. Leaving. Sometimes bridges needed to burn completely before they could be rebuilt stronger, with foundations anchored in truth rather than expectation. I woke early the next morning, watching dawn break over Greenwich Harbor from my hotel room window. The familiar landscape of my childhood looked different in the soft morning light, beautiful but no longer intimidating. Today would be my formal reintroduction to Whitford society at my grandmother's 90th birthday celebration, an event that once would have filled me with anxiety about measuring up to expectations. Now, I approached it with a calm confidence born from years of creating my own definition of success. After a quick breakfast in the hotel restaurant, I spent the morning working remotely, reviewing design proposals from my team at Helix, and participating in a video conference about our upcoming product launch. The familiar professional responsibilities helped ground me in my current identity before stepping back into my past. At noon, I received a text from my mother. Celebration begins at 3 p.m. Your grandmother has specifically requested to see you, privately beforehand. Would 2 p.m. at the house work for you? This separate meeting was unexpected but welcome. The chance to reconnect with my grandmother away from the crowd would make the day more meaningful. I confirmed the time and returned to my preparations. Dressing for the event required careful consideration. The Greenwich Country Club maintained strict standards, a persistent remnant of old-world formality that had always seemed performative. To me, I chose a tailored pantsuit in deep burgundy from an emerging San Francisco designer paired with subtle gold accessories. Professional, yet distinctive. Formal, without being conventional. My hair was styled in a sleek, asymmetrical bob, and I kept my makeup minimal, allowing my natural features to speak for themselves. The nose stud remained in place, a small but significant statement of authenticity. As I drove to my parents' house, I rehearsed potential conversations in my mind. There would inevitably be awkward questions about my long absence, curious inquiries about my unusual career path, and probably thinly veiled attempts to assess my net worth now that the acquisition figure had made news. I determined to navigate these interactions with grace, but without compromising my truth. The Whitford family home looked different in daylight than it had last night. Less imposing, more simply a place from my past. As I parked in the circular driveway, the front door opened and a familiar figure emerged. My grandmother, Eleanor. Whitford Sr. stood in the doorway, leaning lightly on an elegant cane but otherwise appearing remarkably vital for someone turning 90. She had always been a handsome woman rather than a conventionally beautiful one, with strong features that had aged with dignity. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, her posture straight despite the cane, her crisp navy dress likely custom-tailored for the occasion. "There she is," she called as I approached, "the artist who proved them all wrong." Without waiting for me to reach her, she started down the front steps, waving away my concerned protest. "I'm not dead yet, Victoria Louise. I can walk down my own son's front steps to greet my granddaughter after 9 years. We met halfway, and she clasped my hands in hers, studying me with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "Let me look at you," she said, echoing my mother's words from the previous evening, but with a different quality. More appraisal than uncertainty. "Yes, there's the woman I always saw coming. Even when you were sketching instead of listening during those tedious family dinners." I laughed, surprised by her directness. "You noticed that?" "I noticed everything. Still do. It's why I've outlived 2 husbands and most of my contemporaries." She tucked her hand into the crook of my arm. "Walk with me in the garden before the others arrive. We have catching up to do." Instead of returning to the house, she guided me around the side path to the formal gardens my mother had meticulously maintained for decades. December in Connecticut meant the flowers were long gone, but the structured hedges, stone pathways, and classical statuary created an elegant winter landscape. "Your mother tells me you prefer Tory now," she commented as we walked slowly along the gravel path. "I do. It feels more authentic to who I've become." She nodded. "Names matter. I never allowed anyone to call me Ellie, not even your grandfather. Sometimes we need to insist on how the world addresses us." She patted my arm. "Tory suits you. Direct, distinctive, no unnecessary flourishes." We reached a small stone bench, positioned to catch the winter sun, and she indicated we should sit. Despite the December chill, the direct sunlight made the spot surprisingly comfortable. "So," she said once we were settled, "you built something significant out there in California. Something true to your vision rather than the Whitford template." "I did," I confirmed, though the path wasn't always easy. "Of course it wasn't. Nothing worthwhile ever is, especially not breaking from family expectations." Her gaze was direct, unflinching. "I would know." I looked at her with new curiosity. My grandmother had always been the quintessential Whitford matriarch, upholding traditions, maintaining social connections, representing the family name with impeccable dignity. The suggestion that she understood breaking from expectations seemed incongruous with everything I knew about her. She smiled at my obvious confusion. "You think I was born a Whitford? That I always fit seamlessly into this world of old money and older pretensions?" "I guess I never thought about it," I admitted. "I was Eleanor Kincaid, daughter of a university professor with socialist leanings and a mother who scandalized New Haven society by wearing trousers and advocating for women's rights in the 1930s. When I met your grandfather at a Yale faculty event, I was studying art history and planning to work at a museum, a career, not merely community volunteering." This revelation stunned me. My grandmother had never spoken of her background this way before, had never revealed this connection between her early aspirations and my own artistic inclinations. "What happened?" I asked. Life, as it often does. I fell in love with Andrew Whitford, brilliant and ambitious, but deeply traditional in his views of family. His parents made it clear that a Whitford wife had specific responsibilities: social, charitable, familial. No careers, no controversial opinions, certainly no socialist-leaning relatives at family gatherings. She sighed. And I made the choice many women of my generation made. I adapted. You gave up your plans, I said softly. I redirected them, she corrected. I couldn't work at a museum, but I could serve on their boards, influence acquisition, decisions, support emerging artists through the Whitford Foundation. I couldn't openly espouse progressive politics, but I could quietly channel family resources toward causes I believed in. She turned to face me directly. I'm not saying it was the right choice. It was simply mine, in my time, with my constraints. You made a different choice in a different time with different possibilities. I've admired your courage, Tori, even when I couldn't say so openly. The significance of this confession, shared on the day celebrating her 90 years of life, wasn't lost on me. She was offering not just acceptance but understanding based on her own experience of navigating family expectations versus personal dreams. Is that why you sent me art supplies? I asked. Why you asked about my sketches when no one else seemed interested? She nodded. I recognized something in you. The same restlessness I'd felt. The same need to create rather than merely maintain. But you had opportunities I never did, and backbone I couldn't risk showing. Her eyes twinkled suddenly. You also had your father's stubbornness, which helped. We both laughed at that unexpected comparison. I'd spent so much of my life defining myself in opposition to my father that the suggestion we shared any traits was both surprising and strangely comforting. I have something for you, she said, reaching into the small handbag she carried. Not a birthday gift, that would be backward, but a return. She withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and creased from repeated folding. As she handed it to me, I recognized it immediately. A sketch I'd made of her when I was perhaps 12 or 13, working in charcoal during one of the formal family dinners. I'd captured her in a moment of unguarded reflection, looking out the window with an expression that held both dignity and a hint of melancholy. You kept this? I asked, deeply moved. It was the first time anyone had ever seen me, truly seen beyond the Whitford grandmother persona. This young girl with charcoal-smudged fingers somehow captured something even my husband never recognized. She touched the paper gently. I've kept it in my desk all these years. When things became difficult with your father after your departure, I would sometimes show him this drawing, remind him that your vision had value even if he couldn't recognize it yet. The thought of my grandmother quietly advocating for me during the years of estrangement brought unexpected tears to my eyes. While my parents had rejected my choice, she had been privately honoring it, keeping a connection to me through this simple sketch. Thank you, I said, carefully refolding the drawing. Not just for keeping this, but for seeing me when others didn't. We see each other, I think, she replied. Now, one more thing before the celebration begins. Her tone shifted, becoming more practical. Your father has invited several business associates today who are very interested in meeting you. Lawrence Everett from Meridian Ventures, the Althorpe brothers from European investment circles. They've heard about your success and see potential opportunities. I tensed, anticipating another attempt to draw me into family business interests, despite my clear boundaries. I've instructed the staff to run interference, she continued, surprising me again. You'll be seated at my table with family members who are genuinely interested in reconnecting rather than networking. If anyone tries to corner you with business proposals, Agnes will appear with an urgent need for you elsewhere. She smiled. Conspirationally. I may be 90, but I still know how to manage a social gathering to protect what matters. I laughed, delighted by this unexpected alliance. Thank you. I was preparing my polite deflections all morning. Save your energy for the relatives who will inevitably comment on your nose jewelry or ask when you're planning to marry and have children. Those battles you'll have to fight yourself. She patted my hand. Now help me back to the house. Your parents will be wondering what conspiracies we're hatching out here. As we walked slowly back toward the house, my grandmother leaning slightly on my arm, I felt a shift in my perception of my family history. The narrative I'd constructed of being the sole Whitford rebel, uniquely unsuited to the family's rigid expectations, needed revision. My grandmother's revelations suggested a more complex lineage of adaptation, compromise, and quiet resistance spanning generations. Perhaps my overt rebellion had been possible because of her subtle groundwork over decades. The house was now bustling with activity, staff making final preparations, florists delivering elaborate arrangements for the country club, my mother directing it all with practiced efficiency. She looked up as we entered through the garden door, relief crossing her face. "There you are. We were about to send out a search party." "Your mother and I were having a long overdue conversation," my grandmother replied smoothly. "Some things need to be said directly, not through intermediaries." My mother's expression suggested she understood exactly what this meant, and perhaps worried about what family history might have been revealed. "Well, I hope it was illuminating," she said carefully. "Extremely," I confirmed with a smile that seemed to reassure her somewhat. "The cars will be here in 30 minutes, she said, checking her watch. "Richard and James are already dressed. Tori, would you like to use your old room to freshen up before we leave?" The suggestion of returning to my childhood bedroom gave me momentary pause. Would it be preserved exactly as I'd left it, a time capsule of my teenage self? Or repurposed, my existence erased from the physical space as I had been from family? Narratives? Either possibility seemed emotionally complicated. My grandmother, perceptive as ever, intervened. "Victoria can use the guest suite, better lighting for makeup." She winked at me almost imperceptibly, and Agnes laid out some of my good sherry there, for medicinal purposes, of course. "Of course," I agreed, grateful for the alternative that allowed me to sidestep the emotional minefield of my old bedroom. "Lead the way." The guest suite was a sanctuary of understated luxury, cream-colored walls, antique furniture that somehow avoided stuffiness, windows overlooking the winter garden. On the dresser stood a crystal decanter of amber liquid and 2 glasses. As promised, the lighting was excellent, though I needed only minor touch-ups to my makeup after the garden walk. My grandmother poured 2 small glasses of sherry and handed one to me. "A toast before the circus begins," she said, "to women who know their own minds, whether they shout it from rooftops or whisper it behind closed doors." We clinked glasses and sipped the sweet, warming liquid. In this quiet moment before the public celebration, I felt a connection to my grandmother deeper than any we'd shared before, a recognition across generations of the common struggle to maintain authenticity within the constraints of family expectations. "One last thing," she said, setting down her glass. "Whatever happens with Richard and Eleanor, whatever reconciliation you do or don't achieve, know that you've made me proud. Not because you became financially successful, though that certainly silenced some critics, but because you remained true to your vision when it would have been easier to conform." "That means more than you know," I replied softly. A discreet knock at the door announced that the cars had arrived. It was time to face the wider circle of Whitford connections at the formal celebration. But I felt fortified now, not just by my own hard-won confidence, but by the unexpected alliance with my grandmother, a woman who understood, perhaps better than anyone, both what I had rejected and what I had chosen instead. The Greenwich Country Club was decorated for both the holiday season and my grandmother's milestone birthday. Pine garlands interwoven with white lights draped along wood-paneled walls, Massive arrangements of winter blooms centered each table, and a discreet orchestra played classical selections in the corner of the ballroom. A large display near the entrance featured photographs from my grandmother's 9 decades, her childhood in New Haven, her wedding to my grandfather, family, gatherings through the years, charity events she had chaired, and even recent snapshots showing her vitality despite her advanced age. I paused at this display, searching for and finding a few images that included me. Formal family portraits where I stood stiffly in dresses my mother had selected, a candid shot from a long-ago Christmas morning, a graduation photo from Greenwich Academy. These visual fragments of my earlier self seemed to belong to someone else entirely, a girl I recognized but no longer fully identified with. Strange to see yourself through the family lens again, isn't it? James appeared beside me, impeccable in his charcoal gray suit, expression sympathetic. Like looking at a parallel universe version of yourself. Exactly, I agreed, surprised by his insight. A version that continued along the expected path. Sometimes I wonder about your parallel universe version of me, he mused. The James who might have had the courage to follow a different path if his sister hadn't absorbed all the family's tolerance for deviation. The comment startled me. James had always seemed the quintessential Whitford son, embracing rather than resisting the family legacy, finding satisfaction in the predetermined path. The suggestion that he might have harbored other aspirations cast our divergent choices in a new light. What would that James have done? I asked, genuinely curious. He gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. Environmental law, believe it or not. I did an internship my junior year with a firm specializing in corporate sustainability compliance. Found it fascinating, using business structures to drive ecological responsibility. But when I mentioned exploring it further, he shrugged. Dad made it clear that Whitfords were investment bankers, not environmental crusaders. I had no idea, I said softly. Why would you? We all play our assigned roles. He straightened his already perfect tie. Though I did manage to establish our ESG investment division 3 years ago. Small victories. Before I could respond, we were interrupted by the arrival of distant relatives, Uncle Robert from Boston with his wife and adult children, cousins, from Philadelphia, great-aunts and second cousins whose exact relationships I'd never fully mastered. The initial greetings were predictably awkward, exclamations over how long it had been, carefully phrased questions about my time away, polite mentions of having seen articles about my company. True to my grandmother's promise, the seating arrangement kept me at the family table rather than with my father's business associates, who occupied a neighboring table and occasionally glanced in my direction with poorly disguised interest. My grandmother sat at the center, holding court with remarkable energy for someone her age, deftly steering conversations away from potentially contentious topics and highlighting connections rather than divisions among family members. The formal program began after the first course, a series of tributes to my grandmother's 90 years. My father spoke about her unwavering support of the family business and community standing. A longtime friend from her charitable foundation work praised her visionary leadership in arts patronage. James delivered a warm, gently humorous account of her influence on multiple generations of Whitfords. I hadn't been asked to speak, which was understandable given my long absence. But as the formal tributes concluded, my grandmother gestured to the microphone and made an unexpected announcement. Before we continue with this lovely celebration, I'd like to ask my granddaughter Victoria, Tori, to offer a few words. Her perspective brings an important dimension to our family story. A microphone appeared beside me, offered by an attentive server. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward me with expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension. This was clearly not on the planned program, and my mother's slightly panicked expression confirmed that my grandmother had orchestrated this moment independently. I took the microphone, gathering my thoughts quickly. This was an opportunity, I hadn't anticipated but now recognized as important, a chance to define my return on my own terms, to establish my voice in this gathering rather than being merely observed and discussed. "Thank you, grandmother," I began. "When I was asked yesterday what gift you might want for your 90th birthday, I realized that the traditional presents, flowers, books, photographs, seemed inadequate for someone who has lived such a full and meaningful life. What do you give a woman who has shaped not just a family, but a community through 9 decades of purposeful engagement?" I paused, making eye contact with my grandmother, who watched me with clear-eyed interest. "The best gift I can offer is acknowledgement of the legacy you've created, not just through the Whitford name or social position, but through your quiet influence on those around you. Many here know you as the consummate Whitford matriarch, upholding traditions and standards across the decades. But I've been privileged to glimpse another dimension of your legacy, one of subtle encouragement for those who see the world differently, who might pursue unexpected paths." I held up the folded sketch she had returned to me earlier. "When I was 12, I drew this instead of paying attention at a formal dinner. Instead of reprimanding me, you asked to keep it. You saw value in a different way of perceiving and experiencing the world, even when it didn't conform to expectations." My grandmother nodded slightly, her expression serene but her eyes bright with understanding of what I was conveying, not just to her but to the wider family circle. "Your 90 years have spanned tremendous social change, from a time when women's options were severely limited to today's greater, though still imperfect, freedom to determine one's own path. Through those changes, you've maintained core values, while adapting to new realities, honoring tradition without being imprisoned by it." I turned slightly to address the wider room. "I've been away from Greenwich for 9 years, pursuing a path that diverged significantly from family expectations. In that time, I've built a design career and company based on the belief that innovation happens at the intersection of tradition and transformation, honoring what works from the past while creating new possibilities for the future." My gaze returned to my grandmother. That balance between honoring heritage and embracing change is perhaps the most valuable lesson of your 90 years. It's the legacy I hope to carry forward in my own way. So my gift today is simply gratitude for your example, your quiet support, and your recognition that family legacy is strengthened, not weakened, by embracing diverse expressions of its fundamental values. I raised my glass. To Eleanor Whitford, 90. Extraordinary years of grace, wisdom, and subtle influence. May we all learn from your example. The room responded with raised glasses and warm applause. My grandmother's eyes shimmered with tears rarely displayed in public, and she reached for my hand as I returned to my seat beside her. "Well played," she whispered. "You've given them something to think about without declaring war. The art of diplomatic revolution, another family tradition, though not one we advertise." The celebration continued with dessert and dancing, the formal program giving way to more relaxed socializing. I navigated a stream of relatives and family friends, many now approaching with greater warmth after my toast had contextualized my return within family continuity rather than rebellion. Even my father's business associates, when they eventually made their way to my table, seemed to have received the message that this was a family occasion rather than a networking opportunity. One encounter stood out among many. My Aunt Patricia, my father's sister who had maintained a peripheral relationship to the family due to her unsuitable marriage to an artist, sought me out specifically. "That was beautifully done," she said, taking the seat beside me during a lull in the festivities. "Honoring your grandmother while subtly reminding everyone that the Whitford legacy is more complex than Richard's version suggests." "Thank you," I replied. "I didn't expect to speak today." "Mother orchestrated that deliberately," Patricia said with a knowing smile. "She's always been 10 steps ahead of everyone else, playing the long game. Your return is important to her broader vision of family, which is Survival through adaptation, Patricia replied simply. The Whitfords who insist on rigid adherence to past patterns are actually threatening the family's future. Those who can evolve while maintaining core values are its true preservers. She's been trying to get Richard to understand this for decades. This perspective cast my grandmother's earlier revelations in a new light. Her adaptations to Whitford expectations weren't simply personal compromises, but strategic positioning for gradual change. My own more dramatic departure and successful return now served her long-term vision for family evolution. As the celebration began winding down, I found myself at the edge of the dance floor watching my parents sway to a classic standard. My mother's head rested lightly on my father's shoulder, his hand at the small of her back guiding her with practiced ease. Despite the complexities of our family dynamics, there was genuine affection between them, a partnership that had endured. Because, in their way, they truly understood and valued each other. They make it look easy, don't they? James appeared beside me, following my gaze. The whole Whitford performance. They've had decades of practice, I replied. True. But I think today has been different. He studied me carefully. Your toast to grandmother, the way you've engaged with everyone. You've managed to be authentically yourself while still connecting with family. It's instructive. Are you saying I'm providing a good example, little brother? I teased, using the childhood phrase that had always annoyed him when we were younger. He laughed. Maybe so, big sister, maybe so. As the evening drew to a close, my grandmother insisted on making a final circuit of the room to thank guests personally, leaning on my arm rather than her cane. As we moved from table to table, she occasionally paused to make specific connections, introducing me to the director of a design museum she supported, mentioning a cousin's architecture firm that was exploring sustainable building practices, highlighting a family friend's interest in technologies similar to those my company had developed. I realized she was deliberately weaving me back into the family and community fabric, not by expecting me to conform to Greenwich standards, but by identifying authentic points of connection between my life and others. It was masterfully done, subtle, relationship building that honored both my independence and my heritage. When we returned to her table, she clasped my hand. You'll come see me before you return to California? Privately, not the full family circus? Of course, I promised. Day after tomorrow before my flight. Good. We have more to discuss. Her eyes twinkled with mischief. I'm not finished stirring things up yet. As the family gathered to depart, something unexpected happened. My father, who had maintained his characteristic reserve throughout most of the event, approached me directly while my mother was collecting her wrap. Your toast was insightful, he said, his formal tone not quite masking genuine emotion. You've always seen dimensions to Mother that the rest of us missed. It's a gift, that perception. Coming from Richard Whitford, this was extraordinarily high praise. Acknowledgement not just of my eloquence but of a perceptive quality he recognized as valuable. Thank you, I replied simply. He hesitated, then added, I want you to know that while I may not have supported your chosen path, I've come to respect the determination and vision with which you've pursued it. Those are Whitford qualities, even expressed in unconventional directions. It wasn't a complete reconciliation or unqualified acceptance, but it was significant progress, recognition that my success had come through qualities he valued, even if applied to pursuits he hadn't chosen for me. For Richard Whitford, this represented a major concession. I appreciate hearing that, said. And I've come to recognize that some of what has made me successful, persistence, attention to detail, strategic thinking, are qualities I learned from you, even if I've applied them differently. This acknowledgement clearly pleased him, though he maintained his reserved expression. Perhaps there's more common ground than either of us recognized. As we left the country club, the winter night was clear and cold, stars brilliant above Greenwich's carefully maintained landscape. My mother invited me to return to the house for a nightcap, but I declined gently, needing time to process the day's events and conversations. Back in my hotel room, I stood at the window looking out at the harbor, reflecting on how differently this visit had unfolded from my apprehensive expectations. Instead of feeling diminished by returning to Greenwich, I found myself expanded, able to reconnect with my roots while maintaining the identity I'd built far from them. My grandmother's revelations had been particularly transformative, reframing my understanding of family history and my place within it. What I had experienced as unprecedented rebellion had deeper precedent than I'd known, a lineage of women navigating between personal authenticity and family expectation across generations, each finding their own balance within the constraints of their time. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "How was the Greenwich Gauntlet?" I replied, surprisingly revealing. "Discovered I'm not the first Whitford rebel, just the most obvious one. Grandmother has been playing the long game all along." His response came quickly. "The revolutionaries we never suspect are often the most effective. Safe travels home tomorrow." As I prepared for bed, I realized that home now had a more complex meaning. San Francisco remained my primary home, the place I had chosen and built a life that reflected my true self. But Greenwich was no longer simply the site of rejection and painful memories. It had become something more nuanced, a place of heritage that I could engage with selectively and on my own terms, taking what was valuable while leaving behind what was restrictive. The $12 million acquisition that had triggered my family's renewed interest remained an imperfect motivation for reconciliation. But what had begun as a financially motivated outreach had evolved into something potentially more authentic, a reconsideration of family bonds based on who we had all become, rather than who we had been 9 years ago. I hadn't achieved perfect resolution with my family, nor did I expect to. The tensions between independence and connection, between personal authenticity and family belonging, would require ongoing navigation. But for the first time, I could envision a relationship with my family that didn't require me to diminish myself or pretend to be someone I wasn't. As I drifted toward sleep, my grandmother's toast reversal echoed in my mind. "To women who know their own minds, whether they shout it from rooftops or whisper it behind closed doors." In her own way, across 9 decades of a changing world, she had maintained her essential self within the Whitford framework. I had chosen a more dramatic departure, but our core values, authenticity, creativity, quiet determination, formed a connection across generations and different choices. Tomorrow, I would return to my team at Helix, to the design challenges and corporate politics, to my San Francisco life built through courage and persistence. But I would return changed by this brief immersion in my origins, not diminished or pulled backward, but enriched by deeper understanding of where I had come from and how it had shaped who I had become. The journey away had been necessary, but this selective reconnection offered its own gifts of insight and perspective. The true fortune of my journey wasn't the 12 million that had caught my family's attention. It was the freedom I'd fought for and won, the ability to define success on my own terms, to create a life aligned with my values, and now, perhaps, to engage with my family from a position of strength rather than dependency. That hard-won independence would never be compromised, but it could potentially be complemented by thoughtfully chosen connection. My final day in Greenwich dawned with unexpected clarity, both in the crisp December weather and in my perspective on the complex family dynamics I'd been navigating. After my grandmother's celebration and our illuminating private conversations, I felt a sense of equilibrium I hadn't anticipated when planning this trip. The wounds of the past hadn't magically healed, but they had transformed into something more nuanced, scars that marked significant growth rather than ongoing injuries. I spent the morning working remotely from my hotel room, addressing urgent matters at Helix that couldn't wait for my return to San Francisco. The acquisition integration continued to present challenges, particularly around preserving adaptives, creative culture within the corporate structure. These professional complexities offered a familiar anchor amid the emotional currents of family reconciliation. At noon, I closed my laptop and prepared for my promised visit with my grandmother. We had arranged to meet at her private residence, an elegant Georgian townhouse near the Historical Society, where she had maintained her independence since my grandfather's death 15 years earlier. Though she spent significant time at the family home, particularly for larger gatherings, she had insisted on keeping her own space with her own rules. Her home reflected this independence, furnished with pieces she had personally selected rather than inherited, walls displaying art from contemporary female artists alongside traditional landscapes, bookshelves filled with volumes spanning politics, art history and biography rather than the leather-bound classics that decorated the main Whitford library. It was a space that honored tradition while embracing individuality, much like the woman herself. Agnes, her longtime companion and assistant, welcomed me warmly. "She's in the solarium, Miss Whitford. She's been looking forward to your visit." All morning. I found my grandmother surrounded by winter light in a glass-enclosed room filled with thriving plants, a sanctuary of greenery against the December landscape. She wore a casual cashmere ensemble rather than the formal attire of yesterday's celebration, looking more relaxed but no less regal. "Right on time," she observed with approval as I entered. "Punctuality, one Whitford trait worth preserving. Sit, my dear. Agnes has prepared a light lunch, but first I need your full attention." I settled into a comfortable chair opposite her, intrigued by her businesslike tone. This was clearly not merely a social farewell visit. "Yesterday was illuminating for many reasons," she began. "Not least because I saw how effectively you've established yourself on your own terms. Your professional success is impressive, but more significant is the confidence with which you navigate both your chosen world and the one you left behind." "Thank you," I replied. "That means a great deal coming from you. Now for the matter at hand." She leaned forward slightly. "I've been considering how best to distribute certain assets while I still have all my faculties intact. Lawyers and accountants complicate everything with their forms and procedures after one is gone. This unexpected pivot to financial matters caught me off guard. Was this another attempt, albeit from a different family member, to entangle me in Whitford assets? Grandmother, I appreciate the thought, but..." She waved away my protest before I could form it. "This isn't what you think. I'm not discussing the primary Whitford inheritance or family business interests. I'm referring to my personal assets, those I brought to my marriage and those I've acquired independently over the decades." She reached for a leather portfolio on the table beside her and removed several documents, handling them with a businesslike efficiency that belied her 90 years. Few people realize that the initial capital for Whitford Financial came substantially from my family. My father may have been an academic with socialist leanings, but my maternal grandfather was quite the opposite, a successful industrial manufacturer who left his daughter well provided for. When your grandfather needed investors for his fledgling financial services firm, my inheritance provided critical support. This revelation added another layer to my understanding of family history. The narrative had always centered on my grandfather's business acumen and determination, with little mention of where his startup capital had originated. "Over the years," she continued, "I maintained separate investments beyond the family portfolio. Small positions in companies I found interesting, particularly those involving design innovation or led by women, areas your father considered too speculative for proper Whitford investments." She handed me a document listing these holdings, an impressive portfolio spanning decades, with many early investments in companies that had later become significant market forces. "My personal portfolio now stands at approximately $17 million, she stated matter-of-factly. "I've already arranged substantial charitable donations and provided for Agnes's lifetime care." The remaining 14 million I'm dividing among my grandchildren, with some specific allocations. I tried to process this information. My grandmother had maintained a completely separate fortune all these years, independent of the Whitford family wealth that had always been presented as the source of our privilege. The implications were significant. She had possessed financial autonomy that she had rarely exercised openly, preferring to influence from within the system rather than challenging it directly. James will receive 4 million, she continued. Your cousins Robert Jr. and Elizabeth 2 million each. The remaining 6 million is allocated to you. I nearly dropped the document I was holding. 6 million? Grandmother, that's disproportionate? She raised an eyebrow. Perhaps, but I have my reasons. I don't need it, I said quickly. The acquisition has provided more than enough for— This isn't about need, Victoria. She rarely used my full name now, signaling the seriousness of the conversation. It's about recognition and restitution. You were cut off financially for following your authentic path. While that challenge clearly strengthened you, it represented a fundamental injustice that I allowed to continue too long. She adjusted her position slightly, her expression resolute. I could have intervened when Richard withdrew your tuition. Support. I had the resources. Instead, I made small private gestures, the occasional check for emergencies, birthday gifts slightly larger than customary. I prioritized family harmony over open support for your choices. Her candor was striking. No Whitford admitted mistakes easily, yet here she was acknowledging her complicity in my struggles through inaction. You had your reasons, I offered, touched by her honesty. Reasons, yes. Good ones, debatable. She sighed. I believed you needed to prove yourself independently, without family resources that might dilute your achievement or leave room for others to claim credit. But I underestimated the practical difficulties you would face. She tapped the portfolio. This larger share isn't merely compensation for past hardship, it's investment in your vision. You've demonstrated extraordinary capacity to create innovative solutions and build meaningful enterprise. I'm allocating resources accordingly. The financial gesture was generous beyond expectation, but the acknowledgement behind it meant even more. Recognition that my different path had legitimate value, perhaps even greater value than more. Traditional Whitford pursuits. When would this transfer occur? I asked, still processing the implications. Immediately, she replied. I've already established the appropriate structures. The funds will be transferred to accounts in your name this week. You'll have complete autonomy regarding how they're used. This timeline suggested urgency beyond mere estate planning. Grandmother, is everything all right with your health? She smiled, understanding my concern. My heart is functioning. At approximately 70% capacity according to my last examination. Entirely adequate for a woman of 90, but a reminder that arrangements shouldn't be postponed. I'm not being morbid, merely practical. Relief washed over me, though her matter-of-fact approach to mortality was sobering. Have you discussed this with my father or James? I informed Richard of my general intentions, though not the specific allocations. He disagrees, of course, believing all family assets should remain pooled under Whitford financial management. Her expression turned wry. After 67 years of marriage to his father and watching him grow from infancy, I've become quite skilled at acknowledging Richard's opinions without necessarily deferring to them. I couldn't help but laugh at this characterization of their relationship, which perfectly captured their dynamic of respectful disagreement. And James? He knows he's receiving an inheritance, but not the proportions. He'll understand my reasoning, I think. James has always had deeper insights than his father gives him credit for. She set aside the portfolio and leaned back in her chair. Now, that's enough financial discussion. More importantly, I'd like your thoughts on how we maintain our connection after you return to California. Our rediscovered relationship is more valuable to me than any monetary arrangement. Her pivot from business to personal matters was characteristic, addressing practical necessities efficiently before moving to emotional priorities. We spent the next hour discussing communication plans, regular video calls rather than just phone conversations, potential visits in both directions, her interest in seeing my work environment firsthand if her health permitted travel. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.